Hello and welcome. Today we're stepping back into one of the most remarkable lives in history, a journey that begins on a quiet island in the Mediterranean and rises all the way to the imperial courts of Europe. This is the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. From his boyhood in Corsica to the thundering battles of Italy and Egypt, to the heights of empire and the silence of exile, Napoleon's story is one of ambition, brilliance, and endless reinvention. Today we'll follow his path through triumph and defeat, and try to understand the man behind the myth. In the summer of 1769, on a rocky island in the Mediterranean, a child was born into the quiet rhythm of Corsican life. Olive trees clung to terraced hillsides. The sea murmured along the stone shore, and sunlight drifted gently through fig trees and shuttered windows. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Corsica had only just become French. For centuries it had belonged to Genoa, but rebellion had stirred, led by passionate patriots who dreamed of independence. That dream collapsed when the French invaded. Just 3 months before the birth of the boy who would change the world, the island was annexed. And so, by a strange twist of timing, Napoleon was born a subject of France. Though few on Corsica would yet say the word with pride. His family was of minor nobility. The Bonapartes had lineage and land, but little money. His father, Carlo, was ambitious and politically shrewd. His mother, Letizia, strong-willed and fiercely composed, ran their household with quiet steel. She had 13 children. Napoleon was her second. From her he inherited a taste for silence, pride, and self-discipline. From her, too, a sense of something unspoken, something he would carry behind his eyes for the rest of his life. As a child, Napoleon was solitary, observant, sometimes angry. He watched more than he played. He listened to stories of Corsican heroes, of Pasquale Paoli, the rebel leader who'd once defied France. These stories stayed with him. He saw himself not as French but as Corsican, not as part of the empire, but as something lost in its tide. When he was 9, his father secured a scholarship for him to attend military school in France. It was a remarkable opportunity, but it was also a quiet exile. Napoleon left behind the familiar rhythms of his home, the sea air, the stone paths, the language, and stepped into a cold foreign world. In the halls of Brienne, a military academy, in the northeast, he was mocked for his Corsican accent, for his awkward French, for his dark skin and stubborn silence. His uniform was cheaper than the others. He had no friends in the salons of Parisian families. He kept to himself. But he read voraciously. He devoured Plutarch. He memorized the lives of Caesar and Alexander, Hannibal and Scipio. He stared out snowy windows and imagined battles. While others danced or hunted, Napoleon sketched maps and wrote essays. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around him, that knowledge was power, and that silence could carry ambition. At 15, he moved on to the École Militaire in Paris. His father died the following year, stomach cancer, and the burden of the family shifted heavily onto his narrow shoulders. His mother was left with her grief, her children, and not enough income to sustain them. Napoleon pushed harder. He finished his training in half the expected time, graduated as a second lieutenant in the artillery, and entered the army at the age of 16. The France he joined was still royal, still opulent, still cracking beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Napoleon's early military years were quiet. He served in small garrisons, Valence, Auxonne, rarely in action. He kept to his room, read Voltaire and Rousseau, studied mathematics, and drafted speculative reforms for imaginary governments. His fellow officers found him difficult to know. Some called him cold, some called him brilliant. And then the world changed. In 1789, the Bastille fell. The revolution had begun. France's ancient order buckled. The king was pushed from his throne. Nobles fled. Priests were persecuted. The streets of Paris filled with hunger, speeches, blood and song. And across the country, soldiers began to choose sides. Napoleon returned briefly to Corsica, now swept up in revolutionary fervour. He tried to align with Paoli, the island's ageing revolutionary hero, but they disagreed. Paoli mistrusted Napoleon's support for France. Napoleon mistrusted Paoli's caution. Their split was inevitable. By 1793, the Buonapartes were forced to flee Corsica for good. Their home was burned, their name denounced. They landed in France as political refugees, and Napoleon, a man who once saw France as occupier, now turned to it for purpose and for destiny. He was 24, and he was waiting for his moment. It came at Toulon. Royalists had seized the southern port city and invited the British to defend it. The revolutionary government, desperate, sent troops to retake it. Among them, a young artillery officer named Bonaparte. Napoleon quickly rose through the ranks. He surveyed the harbour, reorganised batteries, deployed guns to key positions, and mapped out a plan. When the assault came, his artillery crushed the resistance. The British withdrew. Toulon fell. He was promoted to Brigadier General. And for the first time Paris took notice. He wrote dispatches filled with clarity and ambition. He saw strategy as language, precise, cold, poetic. His rise was not meteoric yet, but he had broken through the surface. Then came Robespierre's fall. The Jacobin regime collapsed. Chaos returned. Napoleon, associated with some of Robespierre's allies, was briefly arrested. For months he drifted, no command, no power. His sword gathered dust, but France was not done with him. In 1795, royalists once again threatened Paris. The government, weak and anxious, remembered Toulon. They summoned Bonaparte. He accepted. He ordered his men to load the cannons with grape shot, tiny iron balls meant for close-range devastation. He placed them at key intersections across the city. When the mob came, he fired. The rebellion dissolved in smoke and blood. The Directory was saved, and Napoleon was rewarded. He was made commander of the Army of the Interior, and shortly after, of the Army of Italy. It was a tired army, hungry, poorly led, but it was an army. His army. He had just married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of charm and influence, older than him, graceful and Parisian. He adored her. She, in turn, found him peculiar, intense and powerful. He wrote her letters filled with fire. "You are my soul, my universe, my joy. I long for your embrace as a drowning man longs for air." With her name still warm in his heart, he left for the Alps. At 26 years old, he would step into history. Not quietly, not slowly, but with thunder beneath his feet. The road through the Alps was still laced with snow as Napoleon led his army into Italy. The spring of 1796 brought misty mornings and cold breath, but also a quiet sense of anticipation. His soldiers, half-starved, half-clothed, watched him with suspicion. He was young, untested as a commander, slight in build. But when he spoke, his voice carried weight. "You are hungry," he told them, standing at the foot of the mountains. "The government can give you nothing, but I will lead you into rich lands. There you will find food, honour and glory." and somehow they believed him. He moved quickly. Through treacherous mountain passes, along rough, muddy paths, he pressed his men forward. His army was smaller than the forces arrayed against him, but Napoleon saw not numbers, only possibilities. He divided his enemies. He struck at their flanks, not their centres. He moved faster than they could think, faster than they could retreat. Within weeks, the Austrian allied Piedmontese army sued for peace. The Austrians themselves began to pull back. Cities surrendered. Villages opened their gates. Local populations looked on in awe and confusion as this strange, quiet general in a worn grey coat reshaped the map. Napoleon sent glowing reports back to Paris, filled with numbers, praise for his men, and casual hints of triumph. He also sent art. Sculptures, paintings, treasure, seized from Italian churches and palaces, were packed up and sent north, destined for the Louvre. War to Napoleon was never just a campaign of soldiers. It was a reshaping of ideas, of symbols, of legacy. And in the midst of it all, he wrote to Josephine. His letters were endless, passionate, obsessive. He scrawled his longing between battles and during late-night rides. "Every day, I love you more," he wrote. "Your memory haunts my sleep. Your touch lingers on my lips." He asked for her picture. He demanded news. He told her she must be faithful, though he himself was not. She wrote back less often, and when she did, it was polite, distant. She enjoyed the salons of Paris, the attention, the comfort of the capital. He was away, and though she had married a rising officer, she had not yet realised she had married a rising force of history. In Italy, Napoleon's victories continued. At Lodi, he led a bold charge across a narrow bridge, while musket balls flew around him. His men called him brave, some called him reckless. But after the battle, as the Austrians fled and the bridge was won, something changed. The soldiers began to see him not just as a general, but as destiny. He founded new republics, client states of France, the Cisalpine Republic, the Ligurian Republic. He appointed officials, rewrote laws, reshaped Europe with the pen as well as the sword. In Milan, in Verona, in Modena, people began to say his name in the same breath as Caesar. But not everyone in Paris was pleased. The Directory, France's governing body, watched his growing fame with suspicion. He was winning too many battles, writing too many letters, gathering too many loyal followers. So they offered him a new command, not in Europe, but in the East, Egypt. It was a strange decision. France was not at war with Egypt, but Napoleon saw opportunity. If he could strike at British influence in the region, perhaps he could rewrite the balance of power. And beyond that, he dreamed of glory, of empire, of standing beneath the pyramids and feeling time bow to him. In the summer of 1798, he sailed from Toulon with a fleet of ships and 35,000 men. Alongside them came engineers, scientists, linguists, artists, a full corps of intellectuals. It was not just an army, it was an expedition of imagination. They landed in Alexandria beneath a burning sky. The desert opened before them like a canvas of fire. Heat warped the air, sand slid into boots and rations. But Napoleon pushed forward. Outside Cairo he faced the Mamluks, fierce horsemen in brilliant silks. He arranged his troops in massive squares, the bayonets like bristles on a steel brush. As the Mamluks charged, the French held. He won. He entered Cairo in silence. The locals watched with narrowed eyes. He issued proclamations in Arabic. He tried to speak of peace and progress, but many saw him for what he was, a foreign invader. Still he governed. He established a new administration. protected scholars, toured ruins. He visited the pyramids and gazed upward, struck by their stillness. But disaster struck at sea. At Aboukir Bay, Admiral Horatio Nelson and the British Navy found Napoleon's fleet and destroyed it. Ship after ship exploded. The Mediterranean glowed with fire. Napoleon was stranded. He hid the news at first. He told his men only that communication would be delayed. He doubled down on his role as ruler of Egypt. He led a brutal campaign into Syria. He defeated Ottomans at Mount Tabor, but disease took hold. His soldiers withered in the heat. Hope began to fade. And then in 1799, he heard the news. In France, the Directory was failing. The economy was slipping. The people were restless. Another coalition was forming. Austria and Britain threatened France once more. He made a decision. He left Egypt secretly, slipping aboard a ship and sailing back to Europe. He left behind his army, left them in the desert, in silence. He arrived in France not as a failed commander, but as a returning hero. Crowds greeted him. The streets buzzed. His image had grown in his absence. The people did not question why he had left. They only saw him. Calm, sharp, steady. France was tired of instability, and Napoleon offered something new. Together with a few key allies, including his brother Lucien, he orchestrated a coup. On the 18th of Brumaire, year 8 by the revolutionary calendar, he moved against the Directory. There was shouting in the chambers, protest, resistance. Napoleon stepped into the hall himself. The deputies rose in anger. He faltered just for a moment, but his guards surrounded them. The opposition scattered, and that evening a new government was born. The consulate. Napoleon was named first consul of France. No more chaos, no more revolution. A new age had begun, and it wore a grey coat and stared with pale, determined eyes. The consulate began not with a trumpet, but with a sigh of relief. France, weary of revolution and instability, looked to Napoleon for order, and he delivered it. Not with parades or speeches, but with silence and structure. At just 30 years old, he became first consul of the Republic, but in practice he held all the reins. He moved quickly, efficiently. Laws were redrafted, taxes reformed. He created the Bank of France, stabilising the currency. Roads were repaired, canals reopened. Under his direction, bureaucracy became a machine. Not perfect, but precise. He founded schools called lycées, open to talent, not just birth. His message was clear. Merit would rise. A boy from the provinces could one day lead armies. A farmer's son could become a general, just as he had. He created the Napoleonic Code, a new system of civil law. It simplified centuries of contradiction, abolished feudal privilege, and declared equality before the law. It spread beyond France, across Europe, and in time into legal systems far beyond. But Napoleon was never just a ruler. He was a builder of narratives. He used art, architecture, and ritual to shape how people saw him. Paintings showed him not as a man, but a figure of destiny, calm, glowing, unreachable. In 1702, a referendum confirmed him as first consul for life, and in 1804 he took the next step. He would be emperor. He arranged the ceremony in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The Pope was present, but not to crown him. Napoleon, in a moment of subtle defiance, took the crown in his own hands and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine. The gesture was quiet but thunderous. His message was clear. Power was his to take, not to receive. And with the title came new wars. Britain refused to accept his empire. Austria and Russia aligned once more. The Third Coalition was formed. Napoleon responded, as he always did, by moving faster than anyone expected. He formed the Grande Armée, a new, elite fighting force, well-trained, loyal and vast. In 1805, he marched east, across the Rhine, toward Austria. At Ulm he surrounded an Austrian army without firing a shot. Then in December came Austerlitz. It was cold, mist covered the fields. Napoleon lured his enemies in by appearing weak, drawing them down from the high ground. When they committed their forces, he struck at the centre. His army split theirs apart. The mist lifted. The sun shone through. It was a masterpiece. Over 30,000 enemy soldiers lost. Austria begged for peace. The Holy Roman Empire, after nearly 1,000 years, dissolved. Napoleon stood taller than ever. But peace would not hold. In 1706 he defeated the Prussians at Jena and Auerstedt. In 1707 the Russians fell at Friedland. He met with Tsar Alexander on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. They spoke for hours, two emperors on calm waters, dividing Europe like a chessboard. Back in France, Napoleon's world turned inward. He divorced Josephine. They'd grown apart, and more pressingly, she had given him no heir. It broke something in both of them. She wept. He paced the palace floors, but he signed the papers. He married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. She was 19, he was 40. It was not a love story, but she bore him a son, Napoleon François, the King of Rome. At last, an heir. The empire was at its height. Napoleon ruled not only France, but much of Europe, either directly or through allies. His brothers sat on thrones. French law was spreading. His troops marched through cities that once ignored France altogether. But in Spain something began to rot. Napoleon had removed the Spanish king and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people rose in revolt. Farmers, townspeople, monks, they formed a resistance. British troops arrived to help. It became a war of ambushes, traps and blood. Napoleon called it the Spanish ulcer. It bled slowly. He sent thousands of men. The fighting never stopped. The terrain swallowed them. Morale cracked. Elsewhere, Britain remained defiant. Napoleon declared a blockade. No European ports would trade with them. But smuggling thrived. The economy strained. And worse still, Russia began to slip away from alliance. Tsar Alexander reopened trade with Britain. Napoleon, unable to tolerate defiance, began to plan once more. He would march east. He would punish the Tsar. He would show the world, again, that his will was not to be resisted. In 1812, the largest army Europe had ever seen crossed the Niemen River into Russia. Over 600,000 soldiers. And before them, the endless silence of the steppes. The grass was green on the banks of the Niemen when Napoleon crossed into Russia in the summer of 1812. The wind was gentle, the sky pale and high, and before his vast army stretched a landscape of stillness. He had brought more than 600,000 men, an empire's strength. Frenchmen, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Germans. Wagons groaned under cannon. Drums echoed in the trees. It was not a march, it was a moving city. But the Russians did not fight. They burned their own fields. They fell back, deeper into their own country. Each town abandoned, each well poisoned. The French army pressed forward, but food grew scarce. Water turned brown. The summer heat thickened. Men began to collapse from exhaustion and thirst. And still, the Russians retreated. Weeks passed. then months. Finally, they stood at Borodino. It was early September. The sky was grey, the land flat and pitted. The Russians had fortified hills and earthworks. Napoleon studied the lines, then gave the order. The battle lasted all day. The fields trembled with cannon fire. Soldiers fought hand to hand, muskets jamming in the rain. Thousands died. The French took the ground, but not the victory. The Russians withdrew again, leaving their dead behind. Napoleon marched into Moscow, but the city was empty. No peace envoys, no surrender. And then the flames. Fires broke out across the city, lit by its own people. Wooden homes, churches, palaces burned for days. Napoleon watched from a palace window. Smoke curled around the spires. He waited for a message from the Tsar. None came. He had reached the heart of Russia and found only silence. Winter crept in. The first snows fell. The wind bit at exposed skin. And so, with his army weakened and Moscow in ruins, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. It was October. The cold came swiftly. Temperatures dropped. Horses died in their traces. Boots cracked in the frost. Men wrapped themselves in blankets torn from tents. Wolves circled the columns at night. The retreat became a death march. Cossack raiders attacked from the trees. Rivers froze. Bread ran out. Soldiers froze upright in their sleep. Cannons were abandoned. The road back to Poland was lined with bodies. By the time Napoleon reached the Berezina River, the army was a shadow of itself. He crossed the river under fire, built temporary bridges, and barely escaped with his life. Of the 600,000 who had begun the campaign, fewer than 100,000 returned. And the emperor returned to Paris not in triumph, but in haste. France reeled. Austria, Prussia, Britain and Russia formed a new alliance, the Sixth Coalition. Armies advanced on every front. Napoleon raised new forces, young, untrained, but willing. In 1813 he fought at Leipzig. It was the largest battle Europe had yet seen. 4 days of blood and smoke. His lines bent, then shattered. French troops drowned in retreat as bridges collapsed behind them. He withdrew into France. Still he fought. In 1814, as the Allies entered Paris, Napoleon tried one final campaign, darting through the countryside, winning small battles, but it was too late. His marshals, weary and broken, begged him to stop. On April 6, 1814, he abdicated. He said goodbye to the Imperial Guard in the courtyard of Fontainebleau, his voice thick. "I go, but you will remain. Never forget what we have accomplished." They wept. He was sent to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast. He became Emperor of a rock. He governed with care, rebuilt roads, designed gardens, but he watched the horizon, and he listened. In France, King Louis XVIII struggled. The people grumbled. Napoleon's name returned to their lips. And in 1815 he escaped. He landed on French soil with a few hundred men. When soldiers came to arrest him, he stepped forward, opened his coat and said, "If any among you would shoot your emperor, here I stand." No one fired. They joined him. He marched to Paris. The 100 Days had begun. Europe trembled. Armies formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, they all gathered once more. Napoleon struck first. He marched into Belgium. On June 18, 1815, near a quiet village called Waterloo, he faced the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Blücher. It rained. The fields turned to mud. He delayed the attack, hoping the ground would dry. It did not. His cavalry became bogged down. His infantry broke against the British squares. The Prussians arrived in the afternoon. The French lines folded. The Guard, his most loyal troops, refused to surrender. Surrounded, they were cut down. Napoleon fled. He returned to Paris. This time, there would be no return. He abdicated once more. The Allies sent him far, farther than Elba, to St. Helena, a barren island in the South Atlantic. Windy, isolated, final. There, in a stone house called Longwood, he spent the last 6 years of his life. He dictated his memoirs, walked the cliffs, watched the sea. He missed his son. He missed his country. He spoke of his battles, his mistakes, his dreams. In his final months he weakened. He asked for black clothes. He spoke less. On May 5th, 1821, as a storm passed over the island, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51. His last words were soft. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. The man who had crossed deserts, climbed empires and challenged the world, now lay silent beneath foreign stars. But his name did not disappear. It moved through time. It echoed in classrooms, in poems, in the silence of museums. He was not always right, not always just, but he was unforgettable, and long after his footsteps vanished from the roads of Europe, the world still remembered the shape of them.